They watched the rumors spread like wildfire, expecting you to burn with them. Instead, you walked through the smoke without losing your name, your focus, or your soul. Now, a room full of authority figures is staring at the evidence, wondering how you survived what was designed to destroy you. They expected weakness. You gave them silence. They expected collapse. You gave them evolution. And the most disturbing part? You never needed revenge. Your survival became the answer. Today, they're amazed because the gossip that once surrounded you became the very pressure that forged you into someone they can no longer underestimate or control. They thought they could destroy your reputation simply by controlling the story people heard about you. They whispered, exaggerated, twisted harmless moments into suspicious ones, and repeated the same accusations until they hoped repetition would make fiction feel like fact. They wanted people to look at you differently. They wanted your confidence to crack. They wanted you to become so desperate to defend yourself that you would expose your emotions, lose your composure, and give them something new to talk about. But you did something they never expected. You refused to become the character they invented. You realized something powerful. When people are committed to misunderstanding you, explaining yourself endlessly becomes another trap. So you stopped chasing every rumor. You stopped correcting every whisper. You stopped begging people to see the truth. And that silence was not weakness. It was discipline. While they were busy talking, you were rebuilding. While they were discussing your failures, you were studying your future. While they were gathering people against you, you were gathering pieces of yourself that had been broken by years of disappointment, betrayal, and unnecessary drama. That is what they failed to understand. They thought the gossip was destroying you, but it was actually revealing you. Every accusation forced you to discover another layer of patience. Every betrayal taught you discernment. Every false story taught you that your identity could not depend on other people's opinions. Every attempt to embarrass you gave you another reason to become emotionally independent. And eventually, something strange happened. You became harder to provoke. The same words that once would have kept you awake no longer had the power to control your mood. The same people who once could ruin your entire day became background noise. Their opinions became smaller because your understanding of yourself became larger. That is when the balance of power changed. They were still talking, but you were no longer listening. They were still watching, but you were no longer performing. They were still waiting for your breakdown, but you were quietly becoming someone they could not recognize. This is why your survival has shocked people who witnessed what happened. They expected the pressure to produce desperation. Instead, it produced maturity. They expected the gossip to make you bitter. Instead, it made you selective. They expected you to become obsessed with proving yourself innocent. Instead, you became obsessed with becoming better. And there is a brutal lesson hidden inside that transformation. Sometimes the greatest response to a false story is not a louder story. It is a better life. You cannot control every mouth that speaks about you. You cannot monitor every conversation happening behind closed doors. You cannot force everyone to understand your intentions, but you can control what happens inside you after the noise begins. You can choose not to become cruel because someone treated you unfairly. You can choose not to become dishonest because someone lied about you. You can choose not to abandon your principles simply because other people abandoned theirs. That is where your real victory begins, because when you refuse to let gossip change your character, the people spreading it eventually face an uncomfortable reality. They never controlled you in the first place. They only revealed themselves. And now the very people who watched the situation unfold are beginning to notice the difference. They see that you are calmer, more careful, more difficult to manipulate. You no longer react to every provocation. You observe. You think. You move when the moment is right. The rumor campaign may have introduced you to pain, but it also introduced you to your own strength. And that strength did not arrive with applause. It was built quietly, in moments nobody witnessed, when you had every reason to give up but decided to keep moving anyway, until the people who expected your destruction were forced to watch you become impossible to destroy. They expected you to react. That was the entire plan. They believed that if they pushed the right buttons, repeated the right rumors, questioned your character, and surrounded you with enough pressure, eventually you would lose control. They wanted an emotional explosion because an explosion would give them exactly what they needed, evidence they could use against you. They wanted to point at your reaction and say, "See, this is who they really are." But you refused to give them that satisfaction. You became silent, not because you were afraid, not because you had nothing to say. You became silent because you finally understood that not every battle deserves your voice. There is a different kind of power in watching someone provoke you and realizing they no longer have access to your emotions. They can speak, they can whisper, they can exaggerate, they can create stories that have nothing to do with reality. But if you refuse to react impulsively, their entire strategy begins collapsing. They expected chaos. You gave them composure. They expected anger. You gave them patience. They expected you to defend yourself against every accusation. You gave them nothing they could manipulate. And that confused them more than any argument ever could. Because people who are comfortable controlling others through emotional pressure become uncomfortable when their target stops responding predictably. They know how to deal with anger. They know how to deal with desperation. They know how to deal with someone begging to be understood. But they do not know what to do with someone who simply looks at the situation, understands what is happening, and chooses not to participate. Your silence became a boundary. It said, "You do not control my peace." It said, "Your opinion does not define my identity." It said, "I will not destroy myself trying to convince you of something you have already decided not to believe." That is not weakness. That is emotional discipline. There were probably moments when you wanted to respond, moments when you had the perfect sentence ready, moments when you knew exactly what to say to expose the hypocrisy, the contradictions, and the hidden motives. But you learned that winning an argument is not always the same thing as winning the situation. Sometimes the strongest move is walking away before your emotions become someone else's weapon. Sometimes the smartest response is allowing time to reveal what anger cannot. And sometimes silence creates a mirror. When you stop defending yourself against every accusation, people begin observing the behavior of those making the accusations. They start noticing inconsistencies. They notice who constantly talks. They notice who keeps changing the story. They notice who seems obsessed with your downfall. Meanwhile, you continue living. That contrast becomes powerful. The people spreading gossip need your attention to keep the drama alive. Without your reaction, the story loses momentum. Without your anger, there is no spectacle. Without your desperation, there is nothing entertaining to watch. So, you kept moving, you worked, you learned, you improved, you became more focused on your future than their narrative. And eventually, the silence that once looked like weakness began looking like strength. This is where your transformation becomes undeniable. You discovered that peace is not something other people give you. It is something you protect. You do not have to attend every argument you are invited to. You do not have to answer every accusation. You do not have to explain every decision. You do not have to prove your worth to people committed to undervaluing you. Let them talk. Let them speculate. Let them create their theories. You keep building because while they are spending energy discussing your life, you are spending energy creating one they cannot interfere with. And perhaps that is the part that bothers them most. They expected their words to become chains around your mind, but instead those words became another reason for you to master yourself, sharpen your judgment, protect your peace, and walk forward with a calmness that makes it impossible for anyone to use your emotions against you, no matter how loudly they try to provoke you. The more they talked about you, the more they accidentally revealed something they never intended you to discover. Your strength was never dependent on their approval. They thought every rumor would make you smaller. They thought every whisper would weaken your confidence. They believed that if enough people repeated the same story, you would eventually start questioning yourself. But instead, every attack became another layer of armor. At first, the noise may have hurt. You are human. Words can cut deeper than people realize, especially when they come from people you trusted. It can be exhausting to hear stories about yourself that you know are not true. It can make you wonder who is speaking, why they are speaking, and what they hope to gain from it. You may have wanted to confront everyone, expose every lie, and force the truth into the room. But something changed. You stopped measuring your value by the volume of other people's opinions. That was the turning point, because confidence is not believing that nobody will ever criticize you. Confidence is knowing who you are even when criticism surrounds you. It is being able to stand in a room filled with assumptions and still recognize yourself. The people talking about you could only describe the version of you they understood. They could discuss your past, your mistakes, your decisions, your relationships, your failures, and your weaknesses. But they could not see the private battles you survived. They could not see the nights you spent rebuilding yourself. They could not see the moments when you had every reason to quit, but kept moving. They saw the aftermath, they did not see the war. And that is why their judgment could never contain your entire story. Every time they tried to define you, you became more determined to define yourself. Every time they reduced you to a rumor, you remembered that you were much larger than a sentence spoken behind your back. The gossip became pressure, and pressure can either crush a person or reveal what they are made of. You chose to let it reveal you. You became more disciplined. You became more observant. You learned that not everyone deserves access to your plans. You learned that silence can protect your energy. You learned that some people do not want explanations. They want information they can twist later, so you stopped handing everyone the pieces of your life. That was another transformation. You became selective with your words, selective with your trust, selective with your attention, and suddenly, the people who once believed they knew everything about you realized they knew almost nothing. That uncertainty made them uncomfortable. They could no longer predict your reactions. They could no longer depend on your emotional responses. They could no longer assume that one insult would send you running to defend yourself. You had changed the rules. You were no longer trying to win their approval. You were trying to win your own respect. And that is a much harder victory to take away, because once you respect yourself, gossip loses its sharpest weapon. Someone can call you arrogant, but you know your intentions. Someone can call you weak, but you remember what you survived. Someone can misunderstand your silence, but you know why you chose it. You no longer need everyone to understand you. You only need to remain honest with yourself. That is why your growth became so difficult for them to comprehend. They were watching someone who had every reason to become bitter choose discipline instead. They were watching someone who had been misunderstood refuse to become hateful. They were watching someone surrounded by noise become quieter, stronger, and more focused. The irony is beautiful. The gossip they intended to use as a weapon became the pressure that strengthened your identity. Their words pushed you deeper into yourself. Their accusations forced you to examine your values. Their rejection taught you self-reliance. Their attempts to embarrass you taught you emotional control. And now, when people look at you, they may not understand exactly what changed, but they can feel it. There is a different presence in someone who has survived being misunderstood. You no longer need to announce your strength. You carry it. You no longer need to prove that you survived. Your life demonstrates it. And the more they talk, the clearer the contrast becomes between the person they described and the person you continue becoming, until their gossip no longer sounds like a verdict about you, but like a confession about how badly they underestimated the strength you were building in silence. Now, the people who watched everything unfold are beginning to understand something they completely missed in the beginning. They underestimated the person standing in front of them. They saw the gossip, the accusations, the pressure, and the attempts to damage your reputation, but they never saw what was happening underneath. They saw someone being attacked. They did not see someone being transformed. That is why your survival has become so difficult for them to explain. They expected the situation to break you. Instead, it sharpened you. They expected you to become reckless. Instead, you became more deliberate. They expected you to become obsessed with defending yourself. Instead, you became focused on building a life that required no explanation. And eventually, the people observing from the outside started noticing the pattern. You were still standing, not barely standing. Not pretending to be okay, actually standing. You were continuing your work, continuing your goals, continuing to move forward while the people who had spent so much energy discussing you were still trapped inside the same conversation. That difference matters, because anyone can survive a moment of pressure. The real test is what happens afterward. Do you allow the experience to permanently define you? Or do you take the pain, extract the lesson, and become someone who cannot be manipulated by the same tactics again? You chose the second path. The gossip taught you that reputation is valuable, but character is deeper. A reputation can be attacked in a day. Character is built over years. Anyone can create a rumor in minutes, but they cannot manufacture a lifetime of consistent behavior. That is why you stop panicking whenever someone misunderstood you. You realize that time has a way of separating truth from performance. People can pretend for a while. They can manipulate conversations. They can gather temporary support. They can make themselves look convincing. But eventually, patterns speak louder than accusations. And your pattern became impossible to ignore. You kept showing up. You kept improving. You kept refusing to become the person your enemies wanted you to become. That may be the most powerful victory of all, because revenge would have connected you to them. Hatred would have kept you emotionally tied to them. Obsession would have allowed them to occupy your mind long after the conversation ended. But growth gave you freedom. You did not need to destroy them. You simply needed to become unavailable to their influence. That is what authority figures and observers may find so remarkable. They are not simply looking at someone who survived criticism. They are looking at someone who learned how to operate under pressure without surrendering their identity. You learn to pause before reacting. You learn to question information before accepting it. You learn that not every accusation deserves a response. You learn that some battles are won by refusing to enter them. And perhaps most importantly, you learn that your future cannot be placed in the hands of people who are committed to misunderstanding your past. That lesson changes everything. Now you move differently. You listen more carefully. You reveal less. You observe more. You no longer rush to trust people simply because they appear friendly. You pay attention to consistency. You watch actions. You notice patterns. And that awareness is not paranoia. It is experience converted into wisdom. The people who once thought they could manipulate your emotions now realize that the version of you they encountered at the beginning of this storm no longer exists. You have evolved. The pressure forced you to become more conscious of yourself, more protective of your peace, and more intentional about where you invest your energy. So let them be amazed. Let them wonder how you survived. Let them question how someone could walk through that much noise and still come out standing. You do not owe them a dramatic explanation. Your continued progress is enough, because sometimes the strongest proof that someone failed to destroy you is not a speech, a confrontation, or a public victory. It is the quiet fact that you are still moving forward while their voices become smaller and smaller behind you, until one day you realize the people who once tried to define your story have become nothing more than background noise in a life you finally learned to define for yourself.